let's talk about our amazing presenter who is one of my mentors and one of my teachers and such an inspiration. And being in her space and her program has really changed my life in amazing, amazing ways. So I'm so honored that she's here. Chantel Chapman is the co-founder of The Trauma of Money, as well as the founder of What the Finance Is. Chantel is considered a refreshing voice in the financial recovery and education space. She's renowned for her cutting-edge, relatable, and trauma-informed money guidance, drawing influence from 14 years of experience as a mortgage broker, 10 years as a financial literacy consultant, and extensive research in addiction, behavioral science, trauma, and mindfulness. Chantel's distinct disciplines make learning about money the antithesis of everything you would experience through traditional schooling. Chantel currently runs The Trauma of Money, an accredited course certifying professionals or individuals in practicing healing around trauma and money. Chantel has taught and written personal and entrepreneurial finance curriculums for universities and accelerator programs such as Humber College, Wilfrid Laurier University, Ryerson University, Entrepreneur, and Fireword Fellowship. Chantel is also the co-founder of School by K&P, an online school for creative entrepreneurs that also provides free education for communities that have been marginalized across North America. Chantel is a settler of European descent who works and resides on the stolen traditional lands of the Kwantlen, Wasqueam, and Sawasanan peoples. So, welcome, Chantel. We are so delighted to have you. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us today, and please take it away.
Hi, Taryn. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I am in my building right now and my fire alarm just started going off. So I'm now sitting on my patio and we're going to try and make this work. Yes, flexibility and pivoting and being able to be in a state of refinement is what we want to be about. So I'm so grateful to be here and be able to be in this space, in this wonderful community. And it's an important community to me because I am part of a recovery program myself. So I'm very glad to be here, and I'm happy to talk about my favorite topic, the trauma of money. So as Taryn mentioned, I run a program called The Trauma of Money, and we explore our relationship between money and all of the intersections of trauma. And I want to talk a little bit about that today with all of you. So if you feel comfortable in the chat, I would love to start with a question. And that question is this: what is an unhelpful narrative that you have around money and yourself? And if you do not want to say maybe your narrative, you could say a narrative that you believe would be unhelpful around money. I can buy people's love with tangible items. Good one. There's not enough. Unhelpful narrative. I'll never have enough money to pay my bills. Or to pay all my bills, debt, and do the things I want to do. I'm not a saver. Yeah. I have to constantly work hard enough for money. I don't know. Yeah, that's a common one. I don't know. Financial literacy is confusing. That I'm inherently poor. I will never be able to save. Scarcity mindset. I'm not worthy. Yeah. I can't go on vacation because it's not smart to spend money, and that doesn't translate to an outward gain. No one will hire me. Yeah. I get rid of any money I have the second I have it. I will always have enough. Might as well spend it. There's not enough. I can't retire. Yeah. I would love to invite all of you to read through some of these comments and notice if you're feeling a sense of connection here. Just reading this and noticing that maybe some people share similar narratives around money that you do. I'm not good at things like taxes or talking about investments and retirement. So mad I spent money on things I don't need. Yeah. So we're going to start off with the unhelpful narrative. And then we're going to explore some of the depths of trauma of money. And through that, we will come back to a new helpful narrative at the end. Okay, wonderful. So let's go into it. Let's talk a little bit about the trauma of money, because when we hear that, the trauma of money, oftentimes I find the reaction is like, wow, that makes so much sense. I never thought about that. Or yes, like almost this sense of like, I feel seen. I feel seen because so many times, I thought it was my lack of financial literacy or other things that may impact my relationship with money. So let me share my screen with you. So the trauma of money. When I first started developing this program, I had this one question, and it was, what impacts our relationship with money? And originally, I believed it was financial literacy. And I thought if they only taught financial literacy in school, everything would be so much better. So I started a financial literacy company and I taught financial literacy to teenagers, and it didn't really move the needle. I knew everything there was to know about financial literacy, but I still had certain behaviors that were very, very unhelpful. So when I went deeper and I said, what impacts our relationship with money? This is the model that came up. And these are the layers that we explore when we go through the program. And essentially, what we've found is that generational and intergenerational trauma shows up. So having an idea of your ancestral lineage and some of the trauma that they have experienced. Relational trauma. So this is trauma that exists within our lifetime in relation to between us and another person, or it could be an employer, it could be a teacher, it could be within the family. Societal trauma. So this is trauma that we may experience in society, and this could be we experience it. This could be secondary trauma. So some examples of this would be consumerism. So the main narrative of consumerism is that if you ever feel pain or boredom or inadequacy or anything that's not excitement and happiness, there's something wrong with you and you need to fix that. And the solution comes in the form of a product or a service that you can buy. And so when we grow up and we're constantly surrounded by this narrative, it reinforces this, we call it the hedonic treadmill, which is essentially the seeking out dopamine all the time. And I'm going to share a little bit about dopamine with you. And what ends up happening is we experience highs and then lows. And this is a form of societal trauma. And then, of course, there's also colonization and exploitive capitalism. There's also more subtle forms of societal trauma like Instagram, and getting into in the realm of constant comparison. And then we have systemic trauma and social context, and understanding that there are systems that exist and systems within institutions that some of us feel we may want to trust, such as massive financial institutions, our governments, that actually exist in a way where they elevate some and marginalize many. And then there's another category we have called laws of nature. And this is where we really go into exploring different worldviews. So, for example, in dominant culture worldview, when we think about money, we're traditionally taught in a way that there's this way to deal with money that's good, and this way is bad. And so laws of nature has us look at other worldviews. For example, the law of reciprocity and that idea of exchange, energetic exchange. And one thing that I see all the time and has really influenced a lot of the approaches in our work is a lack of reciprocity, where in exploitive capitalism, we see people that take. And then there's folks that are like, I cannot stand this injustice. So they go on the other side and they just give to the point where they've given everything, and they're basically like, in the recovery world, we say, put your own air mask on first. And this is what happens where they're giving, and they're not creating a sustainable life for themselves. And so the way this shows up in our relationship with money is we see it through under earning, undercharging, being afraid to advocate for a raise, paying for things. There's a lot of like codependent elements in the relationship with money here. So how do we shift that? How do we come into balance? And the way we come into the balance is through this idea of reciprocity. So there's always this give and take. And then the last one is financial literacy. And I always say financial literacy last because from what I'm going to show you about trauma is we actually have a very hard time engaging with financial literacy if we are triggered in any of these states. And I'll show you why. So when we hear the word trauma, we think of something maybe big that's happening. And we like to categorize trauma into little t trauma and big T trauma. So little t trauma would be something maybe subtle that maybe has happened over and over that essentially results in you feeling unsafe or unworthy. And it basically creates a reaction in the body and the brain that puts you in a state of survival instead of a cognitive choice. And anytime something that arises that feels familiar to those original traumas, your body will naturally go to that place to protect you. And that is what we call a trauma response. So it's really fascinating to learn about what's actually happening in the brain and the body when we go into a trauma triggered state. And the reason why it's so fascinating is when we know what's happening here, we can use some tools to really come back online and be in a state of being tuned into our cognitive capacity and not in a place of this or that thinking. So when we get into a trauma triggered state, what essentially happens is this front part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, goes offline. And this front part of our brain is really important because this is where our executive decisioning comes from. This is where our fluid intelligence comes from. We have a lot of creativity in this space. This is where we can maybe be presented with a situation that's painful, and we have the ability to see multiple options of direction versus going in like this or that thinking, right? So when this prefrontal cortex goes offline, we go into the middle part of the brain, the emotional part of the brain, and that's where the amygdala sits. And the amygdala is basically searching environments for danger, and it's going to signal danger. And when it signals danger, it tells the brain stem, so down here, the bottom of the brain, the reptilian brain, tells the brain stem to let the body know that it should freak out right now. And how does that manifest in the body? Well, some ways it may manifest in the body is like a shallow breath or tightness in the chest or maybe sweat. I'm actually noticing right now, I'm kind of having a bit of that experience by hearing the alarm sounding, the fire trucks, like that is triggering something that is like danger, right? And so I'm noticing like I'm kind of feeling a bit sweaty and, my mouth is getting a bit dry and my breath is shallow. So when we can start tuning into those experiences in the body, we have the ability to notice through the body's reaction that the brain is feeling in a state of maybe fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. So the brain is triggered. So what can I do with this information that the body is giving me? Well, now that I know that the body is triggered, I can actually use the body and go back in reverse to bring the prefrontal cortex online. So if I'm noticing my breath is shallow, I'm going to take long, deep breaths. And I'm just going to tune into my breath and just kind of slow down and try to regulate my nervous system to bring the prefrontal cortex online. So another interesting area of the brain that can get triggered in a trauma state is this area called the Broca's area. And this part of the brain is associated with language comprehension and speech articulation. So when we get triggered, essentially what happens is the Broca's area decreases, which means we may not have a good ability to articulate what we're trying to say. So think of yourself when maybe you're in a relationship and you want to talk to your partner about finances, and you sit down and you're really triggered and you're really nervous and you're not explaining yourself properly. And you're like, I know what I want to say. It's all in my head, but I can't get it out. This is an indication that you're in a trauma triggered state. This is not an indication that you're not good at money. You don't know what you're talking about. This is trauma on the brain, essentially. So it's really great to know these things, because one of the biggest things that arises with money is shame, right? So when we go to have a conversation about asking for the raise, or having a direct conversation with our partner about finances, and we can't articulate things properly, instantly we go to shame. Well, I clearly don't know what I'm doing. But what if we compassionately went to the understanding that I'm in a trauma triggered state right now, and I actually do know what I'm doing. This is just my body's reaction to something painful I've experienced potentially in the past, or maybe it's my body's reaction to being a woman in capitalism, right? Or whatever your intersection of experiences have been so far. So here's something that we use in the trauma of money that is a very powerful tool to help us tune into the body to get into a state of regulation. So we call this the window of regulation. It's actually from a psychologist, Dan Siegel. He calls it the window of tolerance, but we like to rename things sometimes so they sound a little bit softer and more approachable, because we're not just looking to tolerate, we're looking to find regulation. We also sometimes call this the window of resilience as well. And oh, that's a good nervous system sound for me, the birds. You can probably hear that. So in the window of regulation, we have this scale, 1 to 10. And 1 to 3, we call too little arousal. So you've probably heard of fight, flight, or freeze. This would be like freeze, like a collapse state. So you notice, like, I'm in a frozen state. I don't want to get off the couch. I don't feel like I can do anything. So this is your too little arousal, hypoarousal. There's also another F in the trauma reactions called fawn, which is essentially people pleasing as a trauma reaction. So if you identify as a codependent like I do, when I first learned about fawning, I'm like, wow. So my codependency is a trauma reaction, that people pleasing to keep me safe. And so when I learned that, I was like, where does fawning fall on this scale? And sometimes for me, the fawning will fall on a 2 or a 1. It's kind of like, I've completely, I've got nothing, you could do whatever type thing, right? And then on the other end of the scale is 8 to 10, which we call too much arousal. This is hyperarousal. And this would be like fight or flight. And fawning can also sit on this end too, where you're like people pleasing in action, right? And so identifying and asking, where am I at on this scale of 1 to 10? And if you notice you're outside of this window, what can we do to get into the window? Because the window from 4 to 7 is our state of optimal arousal, where we can function with effectiveness in a stressful situation. So how do we do that? Well, there's multiple ways to do that. And it really goes back to using the body and getting the body to do certain things to basically tell the amygdala, we're actually fine. And let's invite that prefrontal cortex back into the space because we're actually okay. So here's a list of some things that you can do. So mindfulness. So mindfulness is really, we actually started the session with mindfulness when I said, what's an unhelpful money narrative that you have? When you identify something like, I have this belief around money, you are bringing some mindful attention to it. There's a trauma doctor that says we have to name it to tame it. So that's a really good place to start. And then from there, we ask my second favorite question when we bring some awareness to the narrative is, whose shame is this? Who owns this shame? Where did this come from? And that is an example of mindfulness. So separating ourselves, our innately worthy selves, from the narrative, right? Wow, I actually learned this from, growing up in a household in scarcity. And they actually learn this from the generational trauma that they experience. So that's whose shame it is, right? And then window of regulation breathing. So inhaling through the nose very consciously and long exhales. And really just getting conscious about the breath and trying to lengthen the exhale, create an inhale that may be a little bit longer. Cold water therapy is an incredible way to help regulate the nervous system. And even if you do this when you're not in a state of stress, but you develop practice of cold water therapy, it has benefits on regulating the nervous system and dopamine regulation as well, which I'll tell you a little bit about. If you're very in a loop of triggered thoughts, you could put water on the back of the neck, or you could splash cold water on the face, or even just washing your hands in really cold water, singing, humming, chanting, physical activity, soothing your senses. So I'll invite all of you right now to do a practice that I love, where we explore what it's like to tune into the senses. So the first thing I'm going to ask you is to look around your room and orient yourself in your space and notice 3 different things that you see. And I would like you to name them to yourself and name what the colors are. Wonderful. Now I'm going to invite you to close your eyes and notice 3 different things that you hear. And now I invite you to notice 2 things that you feel. So maybe tune into your body and see if you notice how your clothes feel against your skin, and just describe to yourself what that's like. Wonderful. And we'll end by playing around with our nose and the sense of smell, and just notice what you smell. Wonderful. And I invite you to take a long cleansing inhale through the nose. Maybe an audible exhale. And coming back into the space. Wonderful. And just take a second to notice how you feel. Maybe you feel a little bit more relaxed. If you were to go into the window of resilience or the window of regulation scale, where are you at now on that scale? I want to also talk to you a little bit about scarcity, because the psychology of scarcity research is really fascinating, because it has a lot of similarities to what trauma does to us. So scarcity, we know, is when there's not a lot of something available. And maybe we grew up in a household where we experienced scarcity around food, maybe scarcity around housing or money, or scarcity around love. We can experience scarcity in many ways. We can experience it with time as well. So the interesting thing about scarcity is we can have the feelings of scarcity even though something isn't scarce. So the belief of scarcity impacts the brain as if we were actually in scarcity. So that's something really to be aware of there. And now what scarcity does to the brain, what scarcity does to the brain is it directly impacts our cognitive capacity, our fluid intelligence, and our executive decisioning. So how does scarcity do that? Well, it essentially does just what trauma does. Is the prefrontal cortex goes offline when we get into a state of scarcity, and we go into the emotional and the reptilian part of the brain. And here are some of the things that happen in scarcity, or when we believe we're in scarcity. And one thing I will tell you is, when we look at that category of societal trauma, this is one example of societal trauma. In the economics systems in North America, if you go to the North American Association of Economics and read how they define economics, they say it is the study of scarcity. So it's really like built into our economic systems, is like this exploration of scarcity. And so when we're in this state, we do something called tunneling, where all we can see is what is in that tunnel. Very similar to what I was saying is when the prefrontal cortex is offline, you can't see multiple options. You can only see what's in the tunnel. And we become hyper focused on whatever is scarce. Scarcity can impact goal inhibitions. So if you're trying to set a long-term goal of paying off debt, but you're in scarcity, it is basically, it's very, very challenging because the goal inhibition is outside of the tunnel and all you can see is the tunnel right now. So the way to kind of get around that is, one, put out all the fires in the tunnel is step one, and take your long-term goals and create little mini stages of reward that exist within the tunnel. And that's really how you can work to achieve long-term goals within a scarcity tunnel. Also, there's this idea of the suit of slack. So when we have a lot of scarcity feelings going on, we lack slack or we lack bandwidth. And basically what that means is our brain is so focused on whatever is scarce that is taking up so much energy that we can't actually focus on other things because we're exhausted from thinking about the scarcity so much. And an example of this would be, let's say you're on your computer and you've got like 100 tabs open on your computer and you're trying to do things and everything is slower because you have all these tabs open. Well, scarcity on the brain is like having multiple tabs open on the computer, and it'll just naturally slow you down. And then we do something called trade-off thinking. And this is part of what takes up the bandwidth. So if we have financial scarcity, if we want to make a decision about buying something, when we have slack, it's usually a quick decision and it doesn't take up a lot of brain capacity. But when we don't, we have to go back and forth. If I do this, I can't do that. And it's expressing so much energy. And then what that leads to is us feeling exhausted, maybe insecure, maybe experiencing pain. And because we have been so guided by this world that we live in, that the moment you experience pain, you need to soothe it, we have something that happens called the temptation tax, where when we're in that state of scarcity, we're more likely to act out on a temptation. So this is why you might go buy a pair of shoes when you're in financial scarcity, or this is why you might go out and eat when you probably might not afford it at the time. And you're doing this not because you're bad with money, and you're not intelligent enough. It doesn't have anything to do with that at all. It is because you're trying to soothe pain and you're acting on the temptation. And, they say, the research says that being in poverty or being in extreme scarcity is equivalent to not sleeping for one full night if you just experience that thought in a day. So it takes up a lot of energy to be in scarcity. Now, what do we do if we're in scarcity? Well, because we know it impacts the brain in a similar way to trauma, and in some cases, the scarcity exists in the mind, and not all cases. There's absolutely situations where folks are in major financial scarcity. The first thing we want to do is we want to provide some nervous system safety. And that is like finding access to ways of care where we can get a little bit more rest and we can get access to a regulated nervous system so we can create opportunities to get out of this. And you know what? This is not always something that needs to be put on the individual, especially in cases of poverty when the systems are built on scarcity in the first place. So this is sometimes when we have a nervous system privilege, this is where we can and come in and help out folks who are in actual financial scarcity with our nervous system privilege to help basically put out fires within that tunnel. And this can be done. There's so many amazing examples of how this is done in a collective way through different organizations who do microloans that are low interest and things like that, or rent banks and stuff like that, versus predatory lending products for folks who are in pretty serious financial distress, which essentially takes advantage of this scarcity cycle. So in the trauma of money method, and this is very much a holistic approach to working on your finances. If you have any challenging financial situation, step one is always the window of regulation phase. And the reason is because when we are in a trauma triggered state, or we're in a state of a scarcity triggering the brain and the body, it's very challenging to take action. So step one is always the nervous system, always the nervous system. And then step two is that vision phase. And this is really where we work on reclaiming the narratives that are influencing us around money. I want to share a little bit about dopamine. So, because dopamine really influences all of this. And it's all these like puzzle pieces that kind of come together. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter, and it's essentially the hormone of the chase. They call it the reward chemical. And basically, dopamine really cares about the anticipation and the wanting. But the interesting thing about dopamine is the want area of the brain is in a different area of the brain than the like area. So sometimes we will want and chase things that we actually don't even like. And when we see folks who are, compulsive shoppers or have some sort of compulsion, the first thing I ask is, tell me about the journey of the shopping. And if we see something like, oh, I love to buy it, and then I'm like, what do you do when you get it, when it's home? They're like, I don't really care about it. We can tell they're chasing dopamine because it's all about that anticipation. And the thing about dopamine is that basically, the more dopamine that we are creating, we become less sensitive to rewards. So our window that allows us to access releasing dopamine gets smaller, smaller, and smaller. And you can see this being played out in like the addiction world with certain substances, right? And they say with dopamine, dopamine only cares about getting. It does not care about the casualties. So there's this quote, sensory rich, casualty poor. And what happens with dopamine is dopamine exists on a scale. So on this scale, on one side is pleasure and the other side is pain. And when the scale is in balance, we're in homeostasis. This is like the equilibrium. Homeostasis is always where our brain and body wants to be. Now, when we have a surge of dopamine or a surge of pleasure, and so let's say we go like down on the pleasure side all the way, our brain is going to be like, we're not in homeostasis. There's too much pleasure here. So the body will create pain. And the reflex is to create pain to bring you into equilibrium. So what this is saying is the more dopamine we are searching, the more we will experience pain. And if you think about this, think about immediately I thought about the idea of having a wedding and getting married, and there's so much excitement and planning and doing all this thing. And then you often hear folks after they get married, they kind of feel like they have a low, and that's a dopamine high and a low. But imagine chasing dopamine every single day. You essentially, the body will be more open to creating states of pain. Right? And so how do we kind of get off that dopamine treadmill? Well, I mentioned cold dipping. Something that's very interesting about cold dipping is when you go into cold water, you're creating pain. So the body's natural reaction to get into homeostasis is to release dopamine. So the body is going to naturally release pleasure after you've created the pain. And the more you do that, the more you allow yourself to experience pain, the more the body will lean towards the creation of pleasure versus the creation of pain. And this kind of comes down to something we talk a lot about in the trauma of money called hedonic versus eudaimonic. Hedonic is like pleasure seeking all the time. Eudaimonic is looking for meaning. And sometimes a life filled with meaning has painful experiences, but eudaimonic is more about that homeostasis approach to life. And another way we can access this is by focusing on what we call the here and now hormones. And some of the here and now hormones, if we're too dopamine focused, how can we transition to some of these other hormones like serotonin, oxytocin, and endocannabinoid and endorphins? And, it's very fascinating and totally planned is all these ways here will help you access here and now hormones. So like socializing is oxytocin, massage is oxytocin, probiotics for the gut is serotonin, challenging your beliefs, soothing your senses. This is all to get you present in the present moment. This is all to help you access the here and now hormones.
Oh, Chantel, that was brilliant. And the fire alarm, you handled it with such grace. And it was kind of I was giggling a little bit about the timing because the fire alarm was happening when you were talking about our trauma response in our brain and our body. But then when you shifted and started talking about the window of resilience, it all stopped and so it was very interesting timing. But that was such an informative and such a helpful presentation. So thank you so much. We're opening up the floor for questions. So please feel free to use the Q&A option if you're in the webinar, or you can type your question in Facebook and our community engagement will be sending them over to us. But thank you so much. All of the different angles and all the different lenses that you have put into the Trauma of Money program, it is just so well-rounded and so beautiful. So thank you for sharing this important, beautiful work with the world.
Oh, my pleasure.
So let me jump into some of these questions. We have a question from Facebook, and it is, I think I lack respect for money and wealth as I never seem to save money to be comfortable and for the future. How do I change this pattern?
I love this question. Thank you so much, Kelly. There's an area of study that we do called money disorders. And one of the money disorders that we see is called financial rejection. And I would say that a lack of respect for money and wealth would fall under this financial rejection money disorder. And it's something we see often, and it can come from many different places. If money was used in a painful way in your household, or, if you're just looking at how money has been used in exploitative capitalism and colonization, it's so natural to feel that. So how can we separate money as a tool from the narratives placed upon it? And how can we change our view of money so it's used in a way that can serve? And one exercise I would maybe recommend is writing down on the left-hand side all the ways that you don't like that money has been used, that you don't respect. Why don't you respect money? And then the right-hand side is writing down all the ways that money can be a tool of service and a tool of love. And one of the books that we're working with in the next cohort of Trauma of Money is called Money as Medicine. And I just love the title. It's a beautiful title for this journal, this reflection journal about like, how can we take all those negative narratives and use it to be of service to the world, to help the folks who have been marginalized by money.
Beautiful. Yeah, such a great resource. Thank you for that question and that answer. Now, next question is, I find often systems of oppression are often overlooked as part of the trauma of money, and the individual is shamed into thinking their mindset is the only thing blocking them from making and saving money. What would you say to the folks in societal power to help heal trauma at the systemic level?
I think this is such an incredibly important statement. And I'm so grateful that you said this and asked this question. And what we're trying to do with the trauma of money is really bring that idea that it's not all about individual ability around money. And we can do that by saying that, putting the responsibility on an individual to have better financial literacy is just bullshit, considering the systemic injustice and the societal trauma and the generational trauma through colonization and capitalism. So what can we tell the beginning, or that question was, what can we do with folks who have societal power is I think it's important that they have this education as well. And, Jacqueline, who is here with me, her and I have been working on something where we want to work with venture capitalists and investors and help them become more trauma informed to understand the systems. So they're not in a room and, how making someone who is maybe a new entrepreneur of a very impactful social enterprise who doesn't understand traditional finance feel like shame, as it's their own individual responsibility. So I think it's education for sure, and wanting those folks wanting to explore like what's actually happening here at a deeper level, and finding ways to use their nervous system privilege to show up and help in these spaces where folks may not even be able to access that at this point.
Brilliant. Beautiful. Thank you so much. Next, we have a comment, not a question, just a comment that this is so helpful and interesting. It makes so much sense. Thank you for putting this together. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelly.
Then a question. I find it incredibly hard to operate within a capitalist society when I don't necessarily believe in capitalist principles. What do you recommend to help with this?
So thank you. I hear you. And what I recommend is similar to what I was saying before, is how can you reframe money in a way to be used as a tool to do good and be of service. And going back to that example I said, like on the left-hand side, what are all the things that you really dislike about capitalism? And name them. And then on the right-hand side, how are you going to operate your business if you have a business, or how will you spend and save and earn in ways that reimagine capitalism for you? And just get really clear on the way you can interact with money in a way that feels in alignment with your values. And I find that if you don't do that, what happens is there's this like cognitive dissonance. There's like these two conflicting beliefs going on, even though you may be very clear, I don't like capitalism, but you're still living in it. So what happens is we end up self-sabotaging when that arises with these two conflicting beliefs. So I think getting very clear and getting clear on your plan of action of how you can create your own world where you're not living within those capitalist values, but you can still exist within it.
Absolutely. I loved in the Trauma of Money program, we did that group exercise of reimagining capitalism, and it was really inspiring. And there are people like you're here having this conversation. So, we're paving the way. So thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Now, Jennifer from California says, incredibly fascinating and informative. Thank you. The fawn response really resonated with me, as well as the cycle my thoughts, then shame, then searching for more dopamine. So amazing. Thank you for making me feel normal in the sense of my responses. That's just a comment.
Amazing, Jennifer. And I just want to highlight this because this is really important for the nervous system regulation, is feeling normal in this. You know what I mean? Like someone else feels like this too. So thank you.
Exactly. And then a question from Facebook. Do you have a book about this topic?
I have multiple books. Probably like everything that I'm referencing comes from like multiple sources of research. So there's not one single book that has it all in there. So I'm sorry, I can't give you one single book, but yeah, I mean, if you want to learn about scarcity, the psychology of scarcity, there's books on dopamine. Yeah, I mean, it's all comes from so many different places. And that's what we do at the Trauma of Money, is we bring it all together and we show the intersections between all the research.
Yeah. My mom says, but when are you writing a book?
Yeah, exactly. I'll bring a book out one day with it all connected.
Yeah. The book that I'm looking at on my desk right now is Decolonizing Wealth.
Oh, great book. Yeah, that's the author who wrote this book.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, another comment. I have so much anxiety about when or where my next source of income is coming from. I'm afraid of not being able to support myself, save for my future, give back to others, and even enjoy my life. I do my best to trust and do the work, but how can I shift my mindset to be able to work on forward movement, to achieve my goals, and understand that money is no longer going to be a lack in my life?
Thank you, Emery, for your question. So I think this for sure is multi-layered. You know, you really want to understand, like, what is the source of some of the shame that you're experiencing? What are some of the challenges? And then creating a nervous system program for yourself, and then creating a vision, and then working through your inventory, and then creating action items. But I would really go kind of deep into that exploration of some of the scarcity thoughts that you are experiencing, and then maybe inviting a practice, like I said, nervous system practice, and then maybe something focusing on reprogramming the neuroplasticity through, you know, as soon as those scarcity thoughts come up, can you switch it for more of a helpful narrative that's more supportive to you?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you for that. Okay, we have 2 more questions and then we will wrap up. Thank you, everybody. These are so great. So, what would you say to the folks joining Trauma of Money, your course, who feel they are dealing with heavy generational toxic family traumas?
I mean, I'm not sure. I want to answer this in the correct way. So I'm not sure if you're asking if it's a safe environment for them, or I mean, we go into those different layers, and we really work on not opening trauma, but kind of playing above it without cascading it, and trying to use some of the neuroscience and the somatic trauma healing to create a supportive environment if you are dealing with toxic family issues and generational trauma. Many of our students are coming from that place as well. So we really do our best to create an environment where there's community around that and safety around that.
Yeah, perfect. And then this is the perfect last question, Carrie. So thank you. Can you please share about your course?
Yeah, of course. So we actually start on September 22nd, and we have 2 levels of enrollment. One enrollment for folks who are just wanting to heal their own relationship with money, and then another enrollment for folks who want to become Trauma of Money certified. And this allows them to use the work within their work and integrate it, just like Taryn is doing so beautifully. And what I gave you today was really a teaser of what we go pretty deep into. We have 11 different facilitators who I'm so proud of. They're incredible facilitators, and the community space is very, very magical and powerful, and it feels safe. And we have folks from all over the world joining us, which is wonderful. So it's a great networking environment as well. And I would love to offer the She Recovers community 20% off using the discount code She Recovers, all uppercase.
Wow, that is so generous. Thank you so much. I know so many folks who are going to be so excited about that. So thank you so much. Chantel, again, thank you for your time and sharing your expertise and your passion with us.
Thank you.
And for really paving the way and just holding us in such a beautiful, supportive way as we navigate this kind of tricky, sometimes sticky, stucky territory. But you really just hold such a beautiful space. And I learn so much every time I get to spend time with you. So
Thank you, Taryn.
Thank you. And thank you so much, everybody, for being here. To learn more about our Mental Health Monday and all of our upcoming sessions, go to our website, sherecovers.org/mental health Monday. I want to tell you who's coming up next week. Next week, we have Hey Sujo of BetterHelp, and she's going to be talking about what is trauma and how can we heal. So as you may be guessing, in our She Recovers world, we really do have a focus on trauma and trauma-informed practices. And thank you, Lisa, for popping that. I have a free workshop tonight called The Ritual of Money that you're also welcome to join as well. And you can find out about that on my website, tarynstrong.com. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Find Chantel on Instagram, on her website. And of course, you can reach out to any of us if you're looking for her contact. Let us know. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.